The sound started on the third night. Not footsteps, not whispers, breathing, slow, wet, too close to be coming from the end of the hallway. Sarah woke up frozen, listening as the inhale dragged through the dark like air being pulled through lungs that were never meant to exist. She nudged Mark beside her, but the sound stopped instantly, like it knew it had been noticed. The next night it returned, longer, deeper. The children slept with their doors open, and Sarah could hear the breath pause outside each room, lingering as if counting. When Mark checked the hallway, it was empty. No drafts, no vents, nothing that could explain the sound. They installed cameras the next morning. Motion sensors, night vision, every logical protection they could think of. That night, the breathing came back, directly outside their bedroom door. Mark checked the monitor. The hallway camera showed nothing, just darkness. Then Sarah noticed it. A thin layer of steam slowly forming on the wall, rising and falling. Something was breathing, and it was standing inches away from them. By the fifth night, the breathing no longer hid, followed them. When Sarah walked to the kitchen, it echoed behind her ear. When Mark stood still, holding his breath, something else continued breathing for him. The cameras captured nothing until condensation appeared again. Walls fogged where no body existed. Handprints formed without hands. The steam was warm, alive. Their son, Noah, was the first to see it. He woke screaming, pointing at empty space above his bed. "It's watching me breathe," he cried. "It copies me." That night, Sarah tested something she would later regret. She held her breath. The hallway breathed anyway, slow, mocking, patient. The sound moved closer until the air pressed against her face. The smell came next, old water, mold, and something rotten beneath it. When she gasped for air, the breathing stopped, like it had finished borrowing hers. Research revealed the house's history too late. A man had died sealed inside the walls during renovations decades ago. He suffocated, slowly, alone. The breathing grew heavier after that. Angry, desperate. Steam covered the mirrors now, forming words that vanished before they could be read. One night, the breath came from inside Sarah's chest. She felt her lungs move, out of rhythm with her will. "It wants a body," Mark whispered. The hallway answered with a long exhale. Noah stopped breathing in his sleep. For 12 seconds, the monitors screamed while something else inhaled deeply in his place. When he gasped awake, frost coated the walls. "It tried to stay," he whispered. The breathing filled the house, every room, every wall. Sarah understood. Someone had to let it finish its last breath. She stepped into the hallway and inhaled. The moment Sarah inhaled, the house went silent. No creaking, no wind. Even the clock stopped ticking. The air inside her lungs felt wrong. Too cold, too heavy, like it didn't belong to her. She tried to exhale, but her chest locked, frozen mid-breath. Then she felt it, a presence unfurling inside her ribcage, stretching through her veins like mist filling cracks. Her heartbeat slowed, syncing with something older, slower. Images flooded her mind. Darkness behind walls, fingernails torn and bleeding, lungs burning as air ran out inch by inch. This was how it had died. Sarah fell to her knees, hands clawing at her throat. Yet she wasn't choking. She was sharing. The breath moved through her, not stealing, remembering. The walls around her fogged one last time. A single sentence appeared, trembling and uneven. "Let me finish." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded. She focused, relaxed her fear, and allowed the breath to flow fully through her lungs. She stayed still, present, alive. For the first time, the breathing felt calm. The exhale came slowly, deliberately. It poured out of Sarah's lungs like a confession finally spoken. The air warmed as it left her mouth, spreading through the hallway, the rooms, the walls that had trapped it for decades. The pressure inside her chest eased. Her heart regained its rhythm. The presence began to loosen its grip, retreating inch by inch. The house responded. Cracks sealed. The ceiling stopped groaning. The mirrors cleared. For the first time since they moved in, the space felt empty, not haunted but finished. Mark watched from the doorway, unable to move, as Sarah collapsed forward, breathing on her own again. The hallway no longer breathed back. A final fog appeared on the wall, faint and gentle this time. 2 words formed before fading completely. "Thank you." Then the air stilled. No more sound. No more breath. Days passed. Then weeks. The house remained quiet. Too quiet at first. The family slept with the lights on, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. Noah began sleeping through the night again. His chest rose and fell steady and strong. The cameras recorded nothing but shadows and dust. Sarah carried something new inside her. Not fear, but understanding. She had survived something that wasn't meant to be fought, only felt. The house was sold months later. Before leaving, Sarah touched the hallway wall one last time. It was warm. Years later, Sarah taught breathing techniques to trauma survivors. She never explained why she understood fear so deeply, only that breath was life, and denying it was the cruelest thing imaginable. Sometimes, late at night, she would pause mid-inhale. Not in fear, in respect. Some ghosts don't want revenge. They want to be remembered. They want their suffering to matter. Sarah learned that fear doesn't always demand violence. Sometimes it asks for compassion strong enough to stand still in the dark and breathe. And when she inhaled each morning, she did so with gratitude, because every breath was hers, and finished. The first victim was found in the subway, eyes wide open, pupils burned black as if scorched from the inside. There were no wounds, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just that frozen expression of terror, mouth stretched as if screaming silently. The police called it sudden death. The coroner called it impossible. But the city called it the last look. Within days, rumors spread. Witnesses described a man standing perfectly still, forcing people to look at him. Those who did never screamed. They simply collapsed. Detective Mara Collins studied the photos late into the night, unable to shake the feeling that the victims weren't just dead. They were emptied. Something had been taken from them. When a second body appeared, then a third, all with the same burned eyes and frozen terror, Mara knew this wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern, and patterns meant intent. The killer wasn't hunting bodies. He was hunting moments, the final second when fear becomes realization. Survivors were rare, almost non-existent, but one woman lived. She was found shaking under a bridge, eyes tightly bandaged with her own torn shirt. She kept whispering, "Don't let him see him," over and over. When Mara finally got her to speak, the story was worse than any crime scene. The man didn't chase her. He didn't threaten her. He simply stood in her path and said calmly, "Look at me." His voice carried weight, authority, compulsion. Her body obeyed before her mind could. At the last second, she closed her eyes. She felt pressure behind them, like fingers digging inward. Something screamed inside her skull. Not out loud, but inside her thoughts. She said she felt him pull, like her fear was being dragged out through her eyes. When she opened them, he was gone. But something else was missing. "I don't feel fear anymore," she told Mara, crying. "I know I should, but it's gone." Mara felt a chill. The killer didn't just end lives. He harvested what made them human. As the body count rose, the city changed. People avoided eye contact. Sunglasses sold out. Mirrors were covered. Social media filled with warnings. "Look away. Close your eyes." The killer adapted. Victims were found with their eyelids torn open, fingers broken as if they tried to claw their own eyes shut. Mara followed every lead, every camera feed, until she finally saw him. A man of average height, plain clothes, unremarkable face, except for the eyes. They were wrong. Too deep, like tunnels leading somewhere dark and endless. On the footage, people froze when he spoke. "Look at me." They obeyed. Always. Mara paused the video, heart pounding. She realized the truth. The killer didn't force people to look. He allowed them to, and once they did, they gave him permission to take everything. Mara prepared for confrontation. No mirrors, no cameras, no reflective surfaces. She trained herself to move by sound, to keep her eyes lowered. When the call came, another victim, alive but fading, she knew he was close. The abandoned building smelled of dust and fear. Footsteps echoed. Then the voice, calm, certain. "Detective Collins," it said. "You've been watching me." Her pulse spiked. She kept her gaze on the floor. "You don't need to look," he continued. "You already know what I am." The pressure built behind her eyes instantly, as if he were standing inches away. "Fear is a door," he whispered, "and you've spent your life opening it for others." She clenched her fists, blood dripping from her palms where her nails dug in. "Not today," she said. He laughed softly. The sound crawled across her skin. "Everyone looks eventually." The pressure intensified, visions flashing behind her closed eyes. Memories that weren't hers. Final moments. Screams without sound. She realized then how he fed. Not on death. On surrender. Mara raised her head slightly, but stopped before meeting his gaze. "You're empty," she said. The laughter stopped. Silence fell heavy. For the first time, the pressure wavered. She had struck something true. "You steal fear because you have none of your own." A step closer. "You're afraid to be seen." The room trembled. Something inside him shifted. And in that moment, Mara knew he could be stopped. The man froze. For the first time, he hesitated. Mara felt it immediately. The pressure behind her eyes loosened, just slightly, like a grip slipping. His voice changed when he spoke again, no longer calm. "You don't understand," he said. "They want to look. They beg for it." The lights above them flickered violently. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming distorted faces. Victims, watching. Mara realized the truth with sick clarity. The killer wasn't controlling them anymore. They were controlling him. Their stolen fear had hollowed him out, turning him into a vessel barely holding together. "You're nothing without their fear," Mara said, stepping sideways, never lifting her gaze. His breathing grew ragged. Blood began to leak from his eyes, running down his cheeks like tears. He screamed, clutching his head. "Look at me!" he roared, desperate now, broken. But Mara refused. The more he demanded, the weaker he became. The shadows peeled themselves off the walls. They took shape, blurred figures, eyeless and shaking. The victims he had emptied were returning. They surrounded him in silence, closing in slowly. He staggered backward, hands outstretched, trying to command them. "I gave you peace," he screamed. "I took your fear." The figures stopped inches away. One stepped forward and raised a trembling hand. When it touched his chest, the killer screamed. Not in pain, but in terror. For the first time, fear flooded back into him. Raw, unfiltered. His body convulsed as if electricity surged through him. Mara watched as his eyes burned brighter than ever, then cracked, thin lines spreading across them like shattered glass. He dropped to his knees, sobbing. "Make it stop," he whispered. The figures leaned closer. They were not here for mercy. They were here to return what he stole. The figures pressed their faces close to his, though none had eyes. As they leaned in, the killer began to scream uncontrollably. Blood poured from his sockets, nose, and mouth as if his body couldn't contain what was flooding back. Memories burst from him in violent flashes. Every final look, every stolen moment of terror. The air vibrated with silent screams. Mara covered her ears, feeling the building shake. The man's skin began to split along his veins, dark lines glowing beneath. "I see it all," he howled. "I can't stop looking." His body arched unnaturally, bones cracking. The figures stepped back in unison. The fear had nowhere else to go. Turned inward. His eyes ruptured completely, collapsing into blackened pits. He fell forward, unmoving. Silence fell, heavy, absolute. The figures dissolved into smoke, their purpose complete. Mara approached slowly, weapon raised. The man lay still, face destroyed, body twisted. Whatever he was, it was gone. The pressure vanished entirely. For the first time in weeks, Mara felt fear return to her chest. Real fear, human fear. She breathed deeply, welcoming it. Police sirens wailed in the distance. As officers entered, none of them looked directly at the body. Instinct told them not to. The city would call it a heart attack, a breakdown, anything but the truth. But Mara knew. Some killers don't take lives. They take what keeps us alive. Weeks later, the city slowly returned to normal. People made eye contact again. Mirrors were uncovered. Fear lived where it belonged, quiet, protective. Mara closed the case file and locked it away. Officially solved, unofficially buried. But some nights she still felt it, the instinct to look away. And she listened to it, because fear wasn't the enemy. It was the warning. And somewhere deep in the dark, if another voice ever whispered, "Look at me," she would never look. The first sound came at night. A slow, wet grinding, like someone chewing with their mouth open on the other side of the wall. First, Nora thought it was rats. Old houses always had them, but this wasn't the frantic scratching of rodents. This was rhythmic, deliberate, hungry. Every crunch vibrated through the plaster, running straight into her bones. She pressed her ear to the wall, holding her breath. Something moved inside, slow, heavy, dragging itself upward as though climbing. Then the chewing stopped. The wall exhaled a warm, foul breath directly into her face. Nora jerked back, her skin crawling. Walls didn't breathe, but this one did. The next morning, Nora found crumbs on the floor. Not from food, but from plaster. Tiny white chunks covered the carpet beneath the wall. When she touched the surface, a faint squelching noise answered her, like pressing on raw meat. A small crack split open beneath her fingers, revealing something pink pulsing slowly behind it. She stumbled back, screaming. Her husband, Mark, rushed in. But when he touched the wall, the crack sealed shut, swallowing the pink flesh as if it had never been there. Mark didn't believe her. He blamed stress, nightmares, anything but the truth. But that night, the chewing returned, louder, faster. Nora didn't sleep. The house did. At 3 a.m., Nora heard something new. A scraping, like teeth dragging along the wooden beams inside the wall. She followed the sound to the hallway, where the wallpaper bulged outward as if something inside was pushing to escape. The bulge moved, sliding along the wall like a massive worm. Nora froze. The pressure built until the wallpaper stretched thin, then tore. A cluster of human teeth pressed through the opening, arranged in a twisted, circular grin. Blood seeped around the edges, dripping onto the floor. The teeth began to chatter rapidly, clicking together in excitement. Nora backed away slowly, her breath shaking. The wall mouth snapped at the air, tasting her scent. And then it whispered her name. Mark accused her of hallucinating until the wall finally showed him its hunger. The next evening, as he argued with Nora, the floorboards rumbled. A section of the wall split open behind him. Long strands of gum-like flesh shot out, wrapping around his torso and dragging him backwards. Mark screamed as dozens of teeth clamped into his skin, ripping chunks out while pulling him inside. Nora grabbed his hands, trying to hold him, but the wall's bite was stronger. Blood splattered across her face. Mark's scream turned wet, then stopped entirely as the wall swallowed him whole. The flesh retreated. The crack closed. Silence. Not even a drop of blood remained. The house cleaned its own mess. Nora ran to the front door, but it slammed shut before she reached it. The windows sealed themselves with layers of fleshy membrane pulsing like a heartbeat. She was trapped. The grinding started again. Dozens of chewing mouths inside the walls waking up after tasting fresh blood. The house seemed excited. The hallway floor swelled, then split open as rows of teeth formed along the cracks. The house was growing more mouths, more hunger. Nora grabbed a metal lamp and smashed it into the wall. The teeth inside shrieked, recoiling, but quickly lunged back, snapping at the metal. She could feel the house learning her movements, reacting faster. The walls weren't just alive, they were evolving, and she was the only meal left. The house vibrated with anticipation, every wall trembling as if holding back laughter. Nora stumbled into the kitchen, searching desperately for anything sharper than a lamp. The knives were gone, drawers empty, as if the house had swallowed them too. The lights flickered, then dimmed to a deep red glow. The floor beneath her shifted, rising in uneven bumps like knuckles pressing from underneath. A sudden crack burst open across the ceiling, and saliva dripped down, thick, yellow, acidic. Where the drops landed, the counter burned away, hissing violently. Nora covered her head and ran as a massive jaw formed overhead, teeth long and needle-like, clicking eagerly. The jaw snapped shut just inches behind her, shattering tiles. The house was no longer trying to scare her. It was hunting. Nora darted into the basement, slamming the door behind her. The stairs groaned as she descended, each step creaking like a dying rib. The basement smelled of mold and something else. Something iron-rich and metallic. Blood. The light bulb flickered weakly as she scanned the room. That's when she saw them, bones. Hundreds of them. Skulls lined the far wall. Jaws cracked open as though frozen mid-scream. Femurs, ribs, spines, piled neatly like trophies. And among them, Mark's wedding ring. Her breath hitched. Before she could move, the basement walls bulged outward, revealing layers of pink muscle beneath the concrete. Teeth pushed through the meat, forming a second set of jaws circling the entire room. The basement wasn't an escape. It was the feeding chamber. The circular jaw snapped shut, missing her by seconds as Nora dove behind the furnace. The metal groaned under the pressure as teeth scraped against it, sparks flying. The entire room pulsed like a giant throat preparing to swallow. Nora grabbed a rusted pipe and swung it at the pumping flesh. The house shrieked, an ear-splitting sound that made her vision blur. But she didn't stop. She struck again and again until blood, dark, thick and steaming, splattered across her arms. The jaw retracted, wounded. The house growled. She realized something then, could feel pain, meaning it could be killed. Nora's fear twisted into something sharper, rage. Nora climbed the furnace, reaching the exposed electrical box hanging above it. Sparks snapped violently from the damaged wires, dangerous, lethal, perfect. The walls sensed her intention. The entire basement convulsed, teeth snapping wildly, jaws slamming shut in every direction. But Nora held her ground. She yanked the thickest wire free, electricity buzzing through her arm. She pointed it at the nearest fleshy wall. "Eat this," she growled. The moment the charged wire touched the living tissue, the house screamed. A deep, monstrous howl shaking the entire foundation. Flesh cooked instantly, bubbling and peeling away. The jaws thrashed, biting themselves in agony. The house was dying. For the first time, Nora felt power. Flames erupted as exposed wires ignited the drying flesh. Smoke filled the basement, and the monstrous walls convulsed desperately, trying to seal themselves, to survive. But Nora kept the wire pressed against the living tissue, her scream joining the creatures in one final battle of wills. With a deafening crack, the jaw-lined walls split apart. A gush of blood and smoke burst outward, and the entire house shuddered violently, then collapsed inward like a dying beast taking its last breath. Nora crawled out through the broken doorway, coughing, trembling, covered in blood that wasn't hers. Behind her, the house groaned once more, a low, defeated exhale, before sinking into silence forever. She stood beneath the morning sun, shaking but alive. She had been hunted, she had been trapped, but she fought back, and she won. As she looked at the ruins, she whispered, "Not every home deserves to live." Then she walked away, leaving the dead house to rot, and carrying the proof that even the darkest monsters can be killed if you refuse to die. Elias bought the portrait from an antique shop that smelled of damp wood and forgotten time. The painting showed a woman wearing a deep green dress, her face pale, her eyes closed as if frozen in eternal sleep. Something about it felt wrong, but Elias convinced himself it was only the eerie style of the artist. That night, he hung it in the hallway near his bedroom door. As he walked past it, he heard it, the faintest sound. A slow inhale, a long, thin exhale. He froze. The house was empty. No windows open. No wind. The sound came again, soft but undeniable, as if someone were breathing only inches away. Elias stepped closer to the portrait. The woman's chest seemed slightly raised. It wasn't possible. He rubbed his eyes, blaming exhaustion. But when he looked again, a single strand of painted hair had shifted positions. Elias stumbled back, heart pounding. Something was happening inside that painting, something alive, and it was waking up. Elias tried to sleep, but the breathing grew louder in the hallway. Slow, steady, rhythmic, like lungs adjusting after a long rest. He covered his head with the blanket, but the sound seeped through the fabric, pulsing against his ears. Finally, unable to bear it, he stepped into the hallway. The portrait was subtly different. The woman's eyes, still closed, now had faint creases around them, as if she was trying to open them. The shadows beneath her lashes seemed deeper, darker. Elias lifted the painting carefully, intending to put it in storage, but the canvas felt warm. Not warm like a room-temperature object, warm like skin. He dropped it instantly. A soft moan escaped the painting. Elias froze as the woman's chest rose slightly, definitely higher than before. He backed away, whispering, "What are you?" The breathing shifted, becoming harsh, urgent, hungry. It no longer sounded like sleep. It sounded like awakening hunger. The next morning, Elias found scratch marks on the wall beneath the portrait. Long, thin grooves as if fingernails had scraped upward from the floor. The painting itself now showed the woman's head slightly tilted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to confirm something was moving inside it. Her lips, once expressionless, were now parted the slightest bit. Elias swallowed hard. He grabbed his phone, intending to take a picture, but the screen glitched every time he aimed it at the portrait. Static, black lines, a distorted face staring back, sometimes his own, sometimes hers. As he watched, her painted lips trembled. A soft whisper escaped the canvas. "Cold?" Elias stumbled backward and fell. The whisper turned into a drawn, shivering inhale. She was trying to breathe harder, trying to enter the world he was standing in. And the scratches on the wall suggested she had already tried. Elias decided to destroy it. He grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the portrait, his hands trembling. As the blade touched the canvas, a sudden gasp escaped the woman's painted mouth. A real, wet, breathy sound. Her eyes snapped open, revealing dark, hollow sockets swirling with something alive inside. Elias screamed and slashed the knife across the painting. Instead of tearing, the canvas rippled like soft flesh. Blood, thick and dark, splattered across his arm. The portrait shrieked, a sound that shook the entire hallway. The woman's hands burst out of the canvas, bony and shaking, grasping blindly for him. Elias dropped the knife and ran, the portrait's cries echoing behind him. When he glanced back, her arms were growing longer, reaching further out of the frame, pulling herself closer to escaping. The portrait was no longer asleep. It was being born. Elias hid in his bedroom, pushing furniture against the door. The breathing outside grew louder, raspy, hungry, impatient. Then came the scratching, slow at first, then frantic. The woman's voice, once only a whisper, now rasped clearly through the wood. "Warm? Let me in." Elias clutched his chest. This was no spirit trapped in a painting. This was something ancient using the portrait as a womb. A vessel. A door. And it was almost through. Suddenly, the breathing stopped. Silence swallowed the room. Elias leaned in, listening. A soft tap came from the window behind him. Then another. When he turned, his blood froze. The woman's face pressed against the glass. Half-formed, smeared with dripping paint and blood. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, showing rows of teeth forming out of wet pigment. Her voice scraped through the window. "You saw me wake. Now let me live." Elias stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp as the creature's half-formed face smeared down the window, leaving streaks of red and dark green pigment like bleeding paint. The glass began to bulge inward, pushed by something heavy behind it. Each shove came with a sickening wet thud, as though flesh was hammering against the pane. "Warm, warm," the creature croaked, its voice warping, blending with 100 distorted whispers. Elias crawled toward the closet, heart racing so violently he felt it in his throat. Behind him, the window shattered. Not in a sudden crash, but slowly, like melting ice. Shards slid down, dissolving into a fleshy substance. A long, pale arm, still dripping with paint, reached into the room, fingers stretching, bones cracking as they lengthened. The creature was entering, inch by inch, dragging its torso through the broken frame. Its eyes were now fully open, black voids swirling with tiny, moving shapes. As it pulled itself inside, it whispered, "You gave me breath. Now give me form." Elias bolted into the closet and slammed the door shut, shaking as the creature dragged itself across the floorboards. He could hear its paint-wet limbs slapping the wood, each impact leaving sticky smears behind. The breathing was louder now, deep, greedy, excited. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence pressed against the closet like a heavy weight. Elias held his breath. A soft scraping sound began on the door. Not claws, not fingernails. It was the sound of a paintbrush, slow, deliberate strokes. Through the thin crack, Elias saw black bristles sliding across the door, painting symbols he didn't recognize. As the mark spread, the air inside the closet thickened, growing colder with every second. His breath fogged in front of him. The creature whispered, voice echoing through the wood. Everything painted must be completed. The symbols began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Elias realized with horror what she was doing. She was painting him into her world, a trap made of pigment and darkness. The closet walls began to ripple like liquid canvas, colors bleeding through the wood, dark reds, sickly greens, and shades of black that swallowed the light. Elias pressed his back against the far wall, but it pulsed under him, as if something beneath the surface was breathing with him. A low hum vibrated through the tiny space. The symbols on the door flared bright, and the wood vanished, replaced with a swirling vortex of painted darkness. The creature's face appeared within it, now fully formed but still dripping. "Step in," she cooed, her voice layered with dozens of others. "Become art. Become mine." Elias shook violently. His mind screamed to give up, to let the terror swallow him, but something deeper, some spark of survival, ignited. He grabbed a metal bar from a broken shelf and drove it into the pulsating wall behind him. The canvas flesh screamed. The colors recoiled violently. For the first time, the creature hesitated, her face twisting with confusion. Elias realized the painted world could be hurt, and he could still fight. The vortex shuddered, weakening, its edges fraying like torn paper. The creature lunged forward in desperation, its arms stretching unnaturally long to reach him. Elias swung the metal bar again, slamming it across her face. Instead of bones cracking, the impact splattered paint and blood across the swirling void. She shrieked, a sound of pure fury and fear. Elias pushed through the weakening barrier, forcing himself back into his bedroom. Behind him, the creature clawed at the doorway, but its body was collapsing, dripping apart like melting wax. The symbols on the closet door dimmed, flickered, and then vanished completely. The walls steadied, The colors drained away. Elias stood trembling, barely believing he had survived. But then he noticed the portrait lying on the floor outside the closet. Its canvas blank, completely blank, and in the center a wet, red fingerprint, his own. Elias stared at the blank canvas, chest heaving, realization sinking like ice into his bones. The creature wasn't dead, it had merely shed its vessel. A rebirth, a reset. The house felt colder, the shadows thicker. Yet for the first time, Elias felt something else too. Defiance. He wasn't powerless. He had wounded it. He had forced it back. And maybe, just maybe, this thing could be ended. He picked up the blank portrait, gripping it firmly, feeling the faint pulse within the fabric. "You wanted a world to crawl into," he whispered, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But you forgot one thing. I can paint too." He picked up the fallen brush, the same one she used to bind him, and dipped it into the smeared red pigment on the floor. Then he began to paint. Not a door, not a path, but a prison. A seal. A cage made of symbols. Each stroke fueled by fear turned into strength. As he painted, the canvas shook violently, a furious scream echoing from within. But Elias kept painting, and for the first time, the monster feared him. Elias stumbled out of the burning studio, coughing, blinded by smoke and fear. Behind him, the portrait, now a twisted doorway of flesh and paint, collapsed inward with a scream that sounded both human and monstrous. The woman's half-formed body reached through the flames, her melting fingers stretching toward him, dripping color like blood. For a moment, Elias thought she would drag herself fully into the world. But the fire consumed the canvas faster than she could rebuild herself. With one final shriek of rage, the figure cracked apart, collapsing into flakes of ash and wet red pigment. The breathing stopped. The tapping stopped. The world went silent. When the fire brigade arrived, they found Elias trembling on the pavement, clutching the charred remains of the paintbrush he had used to stab the portrait. They searched the studio twice, then a third time. No body. No traces of a woman. Only a blank, burned frame. Its surface smooth, untouched by any paint at all. But that night, as Elias tried to sleep, a familiar sound crawled back into his ears. A faint inhale, then an exhale. Slow, patient, breathing from inside the empty frame propped against his wall. The candle wasn't supposed to whisper. Maya bought it from an old street seller who warned her never to light it after midnight. But that night, unable to sleep and desperate for comfort, Maya struck a match. The moment the flame bloomed, the room exhaled, like something inside the candle had been holding its breath for years. First, she thought it was just the sound of melting wax. Then she heard it. A voice. Thin. Bit. Too close. Whispering her name from inside the flame. Maya! She froze. The hairs on her arms lifted. The whisper continued, stretching, growing rougher, as if scraping through something solid to reach her. The flame swayed toward her despite the still air. Then came a second whisper, deeper, trembling with hunger. Don't blow it out. I just woke up. The words weren't human. They dragged behind them echoes. Multiple voices overlapping in pain. Maya stepped back, heart racing. But the flame stretched higher, casting a shadow on the wall that didn't match its shape. The shadow had fingers, and it was reaching for her. The fingers in the shadow curled slowly, as though testing their strength. Maya stumbled backward, knocking into her bed. The whispering grew louder, multiplying. Dozens of muffled voices trapped under the flame. Some cried, some laughed, some begged. One whispered, "Help me." Another hissed, "Join us." The candle's wax dripped thick and dark. Not white, not yellow, but red, like blood just beginning to cool. Maya stared in horror as a single drop hit the floor and sizzled, releasing a foul-smelling smoke. The flame stretched toward her, flickering with unnatural hunger. "Don't leave," it whispered. "We waited so long." Maya grabbed her phone with shaking hands, trying to turn on the flashlight, but the screen died instantly. The room dimmed further, as though the candle's light was absorbing everything. Colors, sounds, even the cold. Then the shadow stepped out of the wall. Not fully human, not fully smoke. It had a face, melted, eyeless, its jaw hanging as if ripped open. Every whisper in the room spoke through its mouth at once. "Maya, sit with us, forever." Maya lunged for the window, but the glass instantly frosted over from the inside, spreading like veins. Handprints appeared, small, shaking, desperate, pressing from the other side. Children's handprints. A soft chorus of young voices whispered, "Don't leave us again." Her breath caught. Again, the flame behind her roared. The shadow creature took a step, its body peeling away from the wall with wet, tearing noises. The room temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath turned white. The red wax flowed faster now, pooling around the base of the candle like spilled organs. Maya reached for her closet door, but it swung open by itself. Inside stood a woman, ghost pale, drenched in melted wax, her mouth sealed shut as if stitched from the inside. She raised a trembling finger, not to Maya, but to the candle. The woman's voice burst from her sealed mouth as a muffled howl. "Put it out, before it finds a body." Maya spun, heart pounding. The shadow lunged toward her. The flame doubled in size, and the whispering turned into screaming. Maya grabbed a blanket, wrapped her hand, and reached for the candle. But the flame recoiled violently, screeching like metal against bone. The room trembled. The children's handprints on the window began to smear downward, as if they were being dragged away. The wax woman in the closet stepped forward, her stitched mouth splitting slightly as molten wax trickled down her chin. She lifted both hands and pointed at Maya's chest. "You," her voice boomed from everywhere except her mouth, "were chosen." The shadow creature lunged again, its fingers elongating into hooked claws. Maya dove aside, landing on the red wax puddle. It burned like acid, eating into the blanket and stinging her skin. The flame shot upward, reaching the ceiling, forming a silhouette inside the fire. A humanoid shape, thin and trembling, as though assembling itself from the screams trapped within. "Let me in," it hissed. The lights exploded. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the candle's glow. Maya knew then. The candle didn't just contain spirits. It was birthing a new one, and it wanted her as the vessel. Maya screamed and threw herself toward the candle, ready to smother it with the blanket. Anything to stop the birth of whatever horror clawed its way out. But the flame anticipated her. The fire stretched sideways, forming a burning arm that wrapped around her wrist. Her skin sizzled. The voice inside the flame whispered. At last, a heartbeat. The shadow creature charged, merging with the growing silhouette inside the fire. The room shook violently. Furniture lifted off the floor and slammed into the walls. The woman in the closet dropped to her knees, wax pouring from her eyes like tears. "Put out," she roared. Maya gathered every bit of strength she had left, ripped her wrist free, ignoring the searing pain, and grabbed the candle with both hands. Her palms burned, her vision blurred. The flame resisted, twisting like a living serpent trying to break free. But Maya didn't stop. She threw herself to the ground and pressed the candle into the floor, smothering it under her weight. The room erupted in a deafening scream, hundreds of voices shrieking as one. The fire died, the shadow dissolved, and everything went still. For a moment, silence. The silence didn't last. A faint crackling began beneath Maya's hands. She lifted them slowly and froze. The candle, though crushed and extinguished, was bleeding thick, dark wax. Except it wasn't wax anymore. Pulsed, like a heart. A deep thud echoed through the floorboards. Then another. The entire house seemed to breathe inward. The woman made of wax crawled out of the closet, collapsing beside Maya, her fingers trembling as she pointed again at the remains of the candle. Her stitched mouth twitched violently, as if trying to scream. Maya backed away as the crushed candle twitched, then split open. Inside was something small curled, shaking, a deformed, half-formed creature made of wax, smoke, and flesh. It gasped like a newborn, and then it opened its eyes. Not human eyes, but burning red slits, glowing with the same fire she had just extinguished. The creature's tiny chest expanded, inhaling sharply, as if taking its first breath of life. Behind Maya, the walls rippled with shadows. Dozens of trapped spirits shifting restlessly, awakened again. The newborn whispered in a voice layered with hundreds of others. Manga. Maya stumbled backward, shaking her head. No, I'm not. But the creature crawled toward her, leaving streaks of molten wax across the floor. Every movement made a wet, bubbling sound, as if its body were still forming. The spirits trapped in the walls pushed forward, their faces stretching through the wallpaper. Pleading, screaming, warning. The wax woman pointed desperately at the newborn. Her stitched mouth finally tore open with a sickening rip. Don't breathe, the creature hissed, its jaw unhinging far too wide for its tiny skull. A wave of scorching heat blasted from its mouth, lighting pieces of furniture on fire. Maya shielded her face, but something in her chest tugged, a strange pull, as if the creature's breath were trying to draw her soul out through her ribs. She gasped and fell to her knees. The newborn crawled onto her lap, its burning fingers sinking into her clothes, melting fabric and skin alike. It whispered again, louder this time, "Mama, feed me." The room darkened. The candle's dead wick twitched, and the flame, impossibly, began to spark back to life. The wick ignited with a violent snap. The newborn shrieked, not in pain, but in triumph. The flame grew instantly, forming a vortex of burning air around the creature and Maya. Her skin blistered, her vision blurred. The wax woman crawled forward, screaming through her torn mouth, "Kill it before it becomes whole!" The spirits inside the walls began pounding violently, shaking the entire house. Their voices rose in desperation. "Put it out! Put it out! Before it chooses you!" The newborn clung to Maya's chest, its body expanding, bones cracking as it grew larger, stronger. Feeding off her breath, her warmth, her fear. Maya's heartbeat slowed. The creature's heartbeat strengthened. In that moment, she understood. The candle wasn't summoning spirits. It was creating monsters from the souls it devoured. And she was next. With the last spark of willpower she had left, Maya grabbed the newborn by its melting shoulders and tore it away from her body. It screamed. Flames erupted. The wick flared brighter, hungrily. Maya staggered to her feet, clutching the writhing creature. Its body writhed like molten tar, reshaping itself with every scream. The flames surged higher, forming a monstrous silhouette behind it. Long limbs, twisted ribs, a head too large for its body. The creature was becoming whole. "No," Maya whispered. "You won't use me." With a desperate cry, she hurled the creature into the center of the flame. The reaction was explosive. The newborn shrieked, limbs thrashing as the fire devoured it. Not killing it, but pulling it back into itself. The candle began to crack, splitting down the middle. A roar echoed through the house. Dozens of spirits screaming in terror, not rage. The wax woman collapsed, whispering, "End it, end it." The flame flickered violently, struggling to maintain its shape. Its monstrous silhouette reached toward her, melting and reforming in the fire. Maya grabbed the heaviest object near her, a broken chair leg, and lifted it high. The flame hissed, the wick trembled, and Maya slammed the wood down with every ounce of strength she had, right onto the burning heart of the candle. The candle detonated. A blinding flash swallowed the room, followed by a shockwave that knocked Maya flat. The flames collapsed inward, sucking the shadows, the voices, the newborn, and even the wax woman into a violent implosion of light. Then, silence. Thick smoke filled the room, settling like ash from a cremation. Maya coughed, pushing herself up. Her hands were burned, her clothes half melted, but she was alive. Where the candle once stood was nothing, just a scorch mark shaped like a twisted, screaming face. The spirits were gone, the walls still, the room empty. Maya exhaled shakily, tears burning her eyes. She stood, limping toward the door, when she heard it. A tiny, faint crackle. She turned slowly. On the floor, inside the scorch mark, lay a new candle. Small, fresh, perfectly shaped. Its wick moved, ever so slightly, as if breathing. Then a whisper rose from it, soft, childlike, familiar. "Mana?" The wick sparked, and the flame lit itself. Some locks exist not to protect the world from thieves, but to protect the world from what lies behind them. 5 teenagers stood beneath the crumbling archway of the Blackwood mansion, the heavy rain soaking through their jackets as lightning illuminated the rotting facade. They had come seeking thrills, documenting their exploration for social media fame. But the air here tasted metallic, like old pennies and dried blood. Jake, the leader, pushed open the main entrance, the wood groaning under the pressure of decades of neglect. Inside, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the beam of their flashlights whole. A sense of impending doom hung heavy in the stagnant air, pressing against their chests like a physical weight. They laughed nervously, trying to drown out the silence, but their voices sounded flat and dead against the peeling wallpaper. They didn't know that the house was hungry, waiting for fresh souls to warm its cold halls. The hook was set the moment they crossed the threshold, baited by curiosity and sealed by their own arrogance. They were not explorers. They were offerings walking willingly into a slaughterhouse disguised as a home. They moved deeper into the mansion, their boots leaving muddy prints on the pristine yet decayed floorboards. At the end of the second-floor hallway, a single door stood out, wrapped heavily in rusted iron chains. The metal was thick, woven together in a complex pattern that seemed almost ritualistic rather than practical. Sarah pointed out the warning symbols carved into the wood beneath the chains, ancient sigils meant to bind and restrain. Most of the group wanted to leave immediately, feeling a primal instinct screaming that this door should never be opened. However, Jake's ego outweighed his fear, and he pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his backpack. He argued that the chains were just a prank by previous visitors, a story to scare away trespassers. The air around the door was significantly colder, their breath visible in the flashlight's beams. As Jake positioned the cutters around the main lock, a low hum vibrated through the floor, shaking the dust from the ceiling. They ignored the warning signs of the earth itself trembling beneath their feet. The decision was made, the metal was about to snap, and the seal was about to break. With a tremendous effort, Jake squeezed the handles of the bolt cutters, the metal screaming in protest before finally snapping with a deafening clang. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, startling the birds nesting in the attic above. As the chains fell to the floor with a heavy thud, a gust of wind blew from behind the door, though there were no windows in the room. The smell hit them instantly, a pungent mixture of rotting flesh and copper that made them gag. Mike covered his mouth, stumbling back, but Jake pushed the door open regardless. The hinges shrieked, a sound like a dying animal, as the wood scraped against the frame. Inside, the darkness was denser than the hallway, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. They stepped over the fallen chains, crossing the threshold without realizing they had just signed their death warrants. The floor inside was sticky, though they couldn't see what caused the residue in the dim light. Every instinct told them to run, but their feet felt heavy, as if the gravity in the room had increased tenfold. They were trapped the moment the lock broke. Shining their flashlights into the small room, they expected to find treasures or hidden passages, but the sight was far more disturbing. In the center of the empty space sat a single wooden chair, facing directly into the corner of the room. The walls around the chair were covered in deep scratch marks, gouged into the plaster as if someone had tried to claw their way out for years. There were no windows, no other doors, just 4 walls and that solitary chair waiting for an occupant. The bloodstains on the floor were fresh, glistening wetly under the beam of the light, contrasting with the decades of dust elsewhere. Sarah whispered that someone must have been held here, imprisoned against their will for a terrible purpose. The air was thick with the sound of buzzing flies, though no insects were visible to the naked eye. The chair looked inviting yet menacing, as if it expected someone to sit down immediately. Jake laughed it off, calling it a creepy prank, but his voice trembled with underlying fear. The room felt alive, watching them with invisible eyes from the corners where the shadows pooled deepest. Something was missing from the chair, something that had just been released. As they stepped closer to inspect the scratches, they realized the marks were not made by fingernails but by something sharper, like claws or knives. Deep grooves ran down the wall, stained with dark, dried blood that had seeped into the plaster over time. Mike knelt down to touch the floor, pulling his hand back quickly when he realized the sticky substance was warm blood. It wasn't old. It was fresh, pumping from a wound that hadn't happened yet or was happening now. The realization drained the color from their faces, turning them pale as sheets in the flickering light. Sarah began to hyperventilate, backing away toward the door, but the doorway seemed to have shrunk slightly. The chains on the floor began to rattle without any wind touching them, sliding across the wood as if pulled by an invisible hand. They understood now that the chains were not there to keep intruders out of the room. They were there to keep the occupant of the chair inside the room. The horror of their mistake settled in their stomachs like a heavy stone. They had freed a predator that had been starving in the dark for far too long. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, freezing the sweat on their brows as their breath plumed in the air like smoke. A voice whispered from the darkness behind them, not from the room, but from the hallway they had just entered. It was a wet, gurgling sound, like words spoken through a throat filled with blood. "You let me out," the voice rasped, vibrating in their bones rather than their ears. They spun around simultaneously, shining their lights into the corridor, but the hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch toward them, elongating unnaturally against the walls. Jake shouted for everyone to run, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden silence that fell over the house. The door behind them slammed shut with a force that shook the frame, locking them inside the small room with whatever was now free. The flashlights flickered and died one by one, leaving them in total darkness. Panic erupted as they bumped into each other, screaming in the void. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the thing standing among them, invisible but undeniably present. In the darkness, a scream tore through the air as something sharp slashed across Mike's throat. The sound of spraying blood was audible, wet and heavy against the silence of the room. Mike gurgled, clutching his neck as warm life fluid pumped through his fingers onto the floor. He fell to his knees, choking on his own blood, while the others scrambled away in terror. Another flash of light revealed a shadowy figure standing over Mike, its form shifting and indistinct like smoke given shape. It lunged at Sarah, dragging her into the corner where the chair sat. Her screams were cut short by the sound of tearing flesh and breaking bone. The smell of iron became overwhelming, coating the back of their throats with the taste of violence. Jake swung his flashlight like a club, hitting nothing but air, while the sounds of mutilation continued in the corner. They were not fighting a human. They were fighting a manifestation of pure rage and hunger. The room was becoming a slaughterhouse, the walls splattered with fresh red paint made from their friends. The entity moved faster than the eye could follow, appearing behind Jake before he could turn around. Claws raked down his back, tearing through his jacket and skin alike, exposing muscle and bone. He collapsed forward, screaming in agony as the pain blinded him. The last surviving teen, Emily, huddled against the wall, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows. She watched in horror as Jake was dragged across the floor, leaving a thick trail of blood behind him. The thing was playing with them, savoring the fear before the final kill. The chair in the corner was now stained completely red, soaked in the blood of the victims. Emily tried to pray, but the words died in her throat as the entity turned its attention toward her. It didn't walk. It glided, the sound of wet footsteps slapping against the floorboards. The darkness seemed to converge on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She realized there was no escape, no weapon, and no mercy waiting for her in this room. Emily scrambled toward the door, clawing at the wood where the lock had been, but it was sealed shut from the outside. Her fingernails broke and bled as she, desperate, tried to pry the door open. Behind her, the sounds of chewing and crunching stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate approach. She could feel the cold breath on the back of her neck, smelling of grave soil and rot. She turned around to face her death, holding up her hands in a futile gesture of defense. The entity loomed over her, its face a void of endless blackness with two burning red eyes. It raised a hand covered in the blood of her friends, dripping onto the floor with a rhythmic plip-plip sound. Emily screamed as the hand descended, not to strike her, but to touch her forehead. A burning sensation spread through her body, paralyzing her muscles instantly. She fell to the floor, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped within her own conscious mind. The violence was over for her, but the horror was just beginning. The entity lifted Emily's limp body and placed her gently onto the wooden chair in the corner. It faced her toward the wall, just like the previous occupant had been forced to sit. From outside the room, the sound of heavy chains being dragged across the floor echoed loudly. The entity was relocking the door, securing the chains around the outside handle once more. Emily sat in the darkness, alive but paralyzed, waiting for the next group of foolish teenagers to arrive. She could hear their voices in the distance, drawing closer to the mansion, drawn by the legend of the locked room. She wanted to scream a warning, to tell them to run, but her voice was stolen. The chains clicked into place, sealing her fate as the new guardian of the room. The lock on the outside was not for protection. It was a cage for the next victim. The cycle of blood and fear would continue forever, fed by curiosity and sealed by chains. The house was full again, and the hunger was temporarily satisfied. Some houses do not welcome guests. They harvest them. Arthur Blackwood stumbled through the blinding snow, the wind screaming like 1,000 damned souls tearing at his coat. He had been hiking alone when the storm hit, and now, lost and freezing, he spotted a faint glow through the trees. A small cottage stood ahead, its windows flickering with warm, inviting light. It seemed impossible, a house lit and warm in the middle of an abandoned forest during a deadly blizzard. But desperation outweighed caution, and Arthur pushed forward, his numb fingers clawing at the wooden door. It opened easily, too easily, as if it had been expecting him. The moment he stepped inside, the storm's roar vanished, replaced by a comforting crackle of fire and the rich aroma of herbs and meat. He should have run. He should have noticed the silence was too perfect, the warmth too intentional. But his frozen body betrayed him, craving the heat like a dying man craves water. He closed the door behind him, sealing his fate with a soft click. The hook was baited with comfort, and Arthur had swallowed it whole. The interior of the cottage was immaculate, defying the decay that should have consumed it after decades of neglect. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary, thyme, and something metallic underneath, like copper coins or old blood. Arthur removed his wet coat, his trembling hands reaching toward the flames. On the wooden table in the center of the room, a bowl of steaming soup sat waiting, accompanied by fresh bread and a polished silver spoon. The steam rose in perfect spirals, as if the meal had been prepared seconds ago. He approached cautiously, his stomach growling despite his unease. The soup was a deep crimson color, rich and glossy, with herbs floating on the surface. He leaned closer to inspect it, and for a moment, he thought he saw something dark and solid submerged at the bottom. He pulled back, shaking his head, blaming his exhaustion for the hallucination. But the smell was intoxicating, pulling him toward the bowl like a magnet. He didn't notice the faint scratches on the floorboards, leading from the table toward the stairs. Arthur's hunger overpowered his caution, and he lifted the silver spoon to his lips. The soup was incredibly hot, burning his tongue, but the flavor was exquisite, rich, savory, and strangely familiar. As he swallowed, a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt like liquid comfort, like a drug easing his fear. He took another spoonful, then another, losing himself in the taste. But with each bite, the metallic undertone grew stronger, coating his throat with the taste of iron. He paused, looking down at the bowl, and this time he saw it clearly. A small, pale fragment floating among the herbs. It looked like a piece of fingernail or perhaps a sliver of bone. His stomach churned violently, and he dropped the spoon, which clattered loudly against the ceramic. The sound echoed through the cottage, followed immediately by a new noise. From upstairs, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps walking across the floorboards above his head. Someone was up there. Someone who had cooked this meal. The creaking of the stairs grew louder, each step a deliberate announcement of approach. Arthur backed away from the table, his eyes fixed on the dark archway leading to the staircase. A shadow appeared first, elongated and distorted against the wall. Then a figure emerged, but it was not human. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles, and its skin was pale and translucent, revealing dark veins pulsing beneath. It wore a chef's apron, stained with layers of old and fresh blood that had hardened into a crust. In its hand, it held a long, serrated knife that gleamed wickedly in the firelight. The creature's face was a mask of stitched flesh, with button eyes that reflected the flames like black mirrors. It tilted its head, studying Arthur with curiosity, as a cook might study a new ingredient. Arthur tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The creature took another step forward, and the smell of raw meat and formaldehyde filled the room. It spoke, its voice a wet rasp that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. "Welcome to dinner," the creature rasped, its stitched mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. Arthur turned to run, but his legs refused to obey, rooted to the floor by primal terror. The creature moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance in a blur. The serrated knife flashed, and a searing pain erupted across Arthur's forearm. He looked down to see a deep, jagged gash opening, blood welling up in thick, dark pulses. The creature caught the blood in a small silver bowl, holding it under the wound like a chef collecting stock. Arthur screamed finally, the sound raw and desperate. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it wildly. The weapon connected with the creature's shoulder with a sickening crunch, but instead of crying out, the entity simply tilted its head, as if intrigued by the resistance. Black fluid oozed from the wound, smelling of rot and sulfur. The creature dropped the bowl of Arthur's blood and lunged again, its long fingers clawing at his face. Arthur felt hot tears mix with blood as nails raked across his cheek, tearing flesh from bone. Arthur stumbled backward, crashing into the table and sending the bowl of soup flying. The crimson liquid splashed across the floor, and among the herbs and broth, small, recognizable pieces tumbled out. A human molar, a segment of finger bone, a lock of hair. The soup was not made from animals. The realization hit him with more force than any blow. This chef had been harvesting previous victims, cooking them into meals for the next unsuspecting traveler. Arthur was not a guest, he was the next ingredient. The creature advanced, its button eyes gleaming with hunger. Arthur grabbed the iron poker again, but his grip was slippery with his own blood. He swung desperately, but the creature caught his wrist with a hand cold as grave soil. The strength was inhuman, crushing bones with a sound like snapping twigs. Arthur felt his radius fracture, the pain white-hot and blinding. The creature leaned close, its stitched mouth near his ear, and whispered, "You taste of fear. It enhances the flavor." The creature dragged Arthur toward the fireplace, his broken arm trailing uselessly behind him. He kicked and thrashed, but the entity's grip was unbreakable. The heat from the flames was intense, singing his clothes and blistering his skin. The creature forced him down onto a large wooden butcher's block that Arthur hadn't noticed before, stained dark with years of use. Heavy iron rings hung from the ceiling above it. With terrifying efficiency, the entity produced lengths of chain and began securing Arthur's limbs to the block. He screamed until his voice gave out, his pleas swallowed by the crackling fire. The creature picked up the serrated knife again, testing its edge with a long, slender finger. It began to hum a tuneless, ancient melody as it worked. The first cut was precise, a long incision along Arthur's abdomen that peeled back skin and fat to reveal the muscle beneath. Arthur's vision swam with pain, but he was forced to watch as the creature carefully removed a section of tissue, placing it into a clean ceramic dish. As the creature worked, Arthur's consciousness began to fade, the pain becoming a distant roar. Through the haze, he saw the entity move to the fireplace, where a new pot bubbled over the flames. It added the freshly harvested tissue to the simmering broth, along with herbs from the table. The aroma that filled the room was now unmistakably that of cooking meat, rich and inviting, but Arthur knew its source. The creature stirred the pot, then tasted the broth from a wooden spoon. It nodded in approval, its button eyes reflecting the firelight. It returned to Arthur, who was barely clinging to life, and whispered, "The meal is almost ready. You will be part of something eternal." The creature then produced a needle and thread, and with grotesque care, began to stitch Arthur's wounds closed, not to heal him, but to preserve the meat. Each pull of the thread sent fresh waves of agony through him. He realized with final, horrifying clarity that he was being prepared not for death, but for consumption. His body would become the soup, his bones the stock, for the next lost soul who sought shelter. In his final moments, Arthur's eyes focused on the bowl of soup he had eaten earlier, still spilled on the floor. He understood now that every traveler who had ever sought warmth in this cottage had ended the same way, as ingredients in the endless meal. The creature finished its preparations and lifted Arthur's prepared body toward the pot. As he was lowered into the boiling broth, the pain was eclipsed by a profound, existential horror. He was becoming the very thing he had consumed. The last thing he saw was the creature's stitched smile, reflected in the bubbling surface of the pot. Then, darkness. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cottage, all was warm and quiet. The fire crackled contentedly. On the table, a fresh bowl of steaming crimson soup waited, accompanied by bread and a polished spoon. Upstairs, footsteps began to pace again, waiting for the next knock at the door. The lock clicked softly, the house breathed, and the cycle of hunger continued. The warm house was always hungry, and it always saved a seat for dinner. They say that mirrors are not merely glass and silver, but rather fragile doors separating our world from something much darker and older. Elias Thorne knew this folklore well, yet his curiosity as a professional urban explorer always outweighed his deep-seated superstition. He stood before the rusted gates of Blackwood Manor, a Victorian masterpiece left to rot amidst the overgrown woods for decades. The house had a terrifying reputation for swallowing visitors whole, but Elias only cared about capturing the perfect shot for his portfolio. The sky was bruising purple with an incoming storm, adding a dramatic, ominous backdrop to the decay surrounding him. He adjusted his camera strap, feeling the familiar weight of the equipment against his chest. There was a silence here that felt heavy, almost pressurized, as if the air itself was holding its breath waiting for him. He stepped over the broken fence, his boots crunching loudly on dry leaves. He told himself he was just an observer, a ghost hunting for images rather than spirits. But as he pushed open the front door, the hinges screaming in protest, he felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. He was no longer just an observer. He was an intruder in a place that remembered every footstep. The hook was set, the trap was waiting, and Elias had just walked willingly into the frame. The interior of the manor was a tomb of forgotten memories, filled with the pungent scent of damp wood and old, decaying paper. Elias turned on his powerful flashlight, the bright beam cutting through the thick dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Every step he took on the wooden floorboards elicited a loud groan, as if the house was physically complaining about his unwelcome presence. He moved through the grand foyer, where a crystal chandelier lay shattered on the ground like broken ice reflecting his light. He wasn't looking for valuables or gold. He was hunting for atmosphere, for the kind of decay that told a tragic story without using any words. His camera clicked softly as he captured the peeling wallpaper and the shadows stretching long across the hallway. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched from the surrounding darkness. He spun around quickly, shining his light into the corners, but there was nothing there except shifting shadows playing tricks on his mind. He laughed nervously to himself, trying to break the tension that was tightening around his throat. It was just an old house, he reminded himself, nothing more than rotting timber and rusted nails. Yet, the silence seemed to absorb his laughter, leaving him in a void that felt incredibly lonely. He continued deeper into the house, drawn by an invisible thread pulling him toward the upper floor. The staircase was precarious, the wood worn smooth by generations of feet that no longer walked this earth. Elias climbed slowly, testing each step before committing his full weight to the dangerous ascent. The air grew significantly colder as he rose, the temperature dropping noticeably with every step he took toward the second floor. At the top of the landing, a long corridor stretched out, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movement across the hall. He ignored the paintings, focusing instead on the door at the very end of the hallway, which was left slightly ajar. A strange light seemed to emanate from within that room, though there was no electricity in the house to power any bulbs. He pushed the door open, revealing a master bedroom frozen in time. The bed was unmade, the sheets gray with age, but the focal point of the room was unmistakable. Standing against the far wall was a massive mirror, framed in ornate gold that somehow remained untarnished by the years of neglect. It stood out violently against the decay, pristine and inviting. Elias felt a magnetic pull toward it, his legs moving almost without his conscious command. He raised his camera, framing the shot, but something about the glass surface made him hesitate. It looked less like a reflection and more like a deep, still pool of water waiting to swallow him whole. The dust around the room avoided the mirror, as if protected by an invisible barrier. He set up his tripod in front of the mirror, the legs sinking slightly into the dusty carpet beneath them. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a clock that he couldn't locate anywhere in the vicinity. Elias adjusted the lens, focusing sharply on his own image standing within the glass. He looked tired, his face pale under the dim light of his camera's display screen. He decided to break the tension with a bit of humor, something he often did to calm his nerves during solo explorations. He raised his hand and waved at his reflection, a silly, casual gesture meant to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. He smiled at himself, expecting the familiar mimicry of a normal mirror. But for a split second, he thought he saw the reflection blink before he did. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light or fatigue playing games with his vision. He took the photo, the flash illuminating the room in a brief, blinding white burst. When the light faded, the room felt heavier, the air thicker than before. He packed his gear quickly, the urge to leave becoming overwhelming. He didn't look at the mirror again as he turned his back, feeling the gaze of the glass burning into his spine. The silence returned, but now it felt expectant, like a predator waiting for its prey to turn around. Elias practically ran down the stairs, his boots slipping on the polished wood in his haste to escape the manor. The front door seemed further away than before, the hallway stretching out like a tunnel that refused to end. He burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath as the storm began to break overhead. Rain started to fall, cold and heavy, but he didn't care about getting wet. He fumbled with his car keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he tried to unlock the door. Once inside, he locked all the doors immediately, checking the rearview mirror repeatedly as he drove away. He kept expecting to see a figure standing in the window of the house, watching him leave, but the windows remained dark and empty. The drive home was a blur of anxiety, his mind replaying the moment he waved at the mirror. He tried to rationalize the fear, telling himself it was just adrenaline and the creepy atmosphere of the location. But deep down, he knew something had changed during that brief interaction. He arrived at his apartment building, feeling safe only when he was behind his own solid steel door. He showered quickly, trying to wash off the feeling of the house, but the coldness seemed to have seeped into his bones. No amount of hot water could warm him up. Back in the safety of his own apartment, Elias tried to resume his normal evening routine. He made a cup of coffee, his hands still trembling slightly as he held the warm mug. The lights in his living room were bright and familiar, chasing away the shadows that had plagued him at the manor. He turned on the television, filling the silence with noise, anything to stop his own thoughts from racing. He sat on his couch, staring at the screen without really seeing the program. Every time the screen went dark for a scene change, he caught his own reflection in the black glass of the TV. He found himself avoiding looking directly at it, turning his head away instinctively. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the house had just gotten into his head. He finished his coffee and decided it was time to sleep, hoping that rest would reset his mind. He walked down the short hallway to his bedroom, trying to ignore the small mirror on the wall. He changed his clothes quickly, keeping the lights on, unwilling to sit in the dark. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the window. But sleep did not come easily. Instead, a growing sense of dread began to pool in his stomach. He needed water, and that meant going to the bathroom. The need for water became urgent, forcing him out of the relative safety of his bed. He walked down the hall to the bathroom, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. The bathroom was small, tiled in white, with a large mirror above the sink. He turned on the tap, letting the cold water run while he splashed some on his face. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the glass above the sink. When he finally looked up to dry his face with a towel, the bathroom light flickered once, buzzing loudly. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the light to stabilize. It hummed back to life, casting a harsh glare on the mirror. Elias leaned over the sink, gripping the edges tightly, and finally forced himself to look at his reflection. He looked exhausted, his eyes dark with lack of sleep. He sighed, leaning closer to inspect a spot on his cheek. The reflection sighed with him, matching his movement perfectly. He relaxed slightly, feeling foolish for his earlier fear. He turned off the tap and reached for the light switch to leave. But as his hand moved toward the switch, he noticed something in the corner of his eye. The reflection's hand was not moving toward the switch. Elias stopped moving, his breath catching in his throat as he stared into the glass. His own hand was reaching for the switch, but the hand in the mirror was still resting on the edge of the sink. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the flickering light, but the image remained static. The reflection was no longer mimicking him. It was waiting. Slowly, Elias lowered his hand back to the sink, and only then did the reflection move its hand to match the position. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, chilling him to the bone. He wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped inside his chest. He stared into the eyes of the figure in the glass, searching for some sign of humanity, but the eyes were empty and dark. The figure in the mirror smiled, a slow, cruel expression that Elias was not making. He tried to step back, to run away from the sink, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The reflection raised its hand slowly, not in fear, but in greeting. It was the same wave Elias had given in the abandoned house, but this time, the gesture was returned by something else. The entity in the glass was no longer bound by the rules of physics. It was independent, alive, and hungry. The reflection waved again, more vigorously this time, inviting Elias to come closer. The glass surface began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone, losing its solidity. Elias tried to turn his head away, to break the line of sight, but his neck refused to obey his commands. He was paralyzed by a force that originated from within the mirror itself. The figure in the glass started to lean forward, pressing against the surface from the inside. The gold frame of the mirror in his bathroom began to tarnish rapidly, turning black like the one in the manor. He realized with horror that the two mirrors were connected, bridged by the joke he had made hours ago. The reflection mouthed words that made no sound, but Elias could read the lips clearly. It said, "Thank you for the invitation." The bathroom temperature plummeted, frost forming on the tiles around the sink. Elias felt a pulling sensation, as if gravity had shifted and was dragging him into the wall. He clawed at the counter, his nails scratching against the porcelain, but he was sliding forward. The boundary between his world and the reflection's world was dissolving rapidly. There was no escape from the glass now. With a final, desperate struggle, Elias tried to close his eyes, but they were held open by invisible fingers. The reflection reached out, its hand passing through the glass as if it were smoke. Cold fingers wrapped around Elias's wrist, gripping him with impossible strength. He was pulled forward, his face pressing against the cold surface. The last thing he saw was his own apartment fading away, replaced by the dusty room in the Victorian manor. The reflection stepped out into the bathroom, stretching its limbs as if waking from a long sleep. It looked around the modern apartment with curiosity, touching the towels and the lights. It smiled, wearing Elias's face perfectly, but with eyes that held no soul. The entity walked out of the bathroom, turning off the lights behind it. In the mirror, now dark, Elias pounded on the glass from the other side, screaming silently into the void. He was trapped in the reflection, forever watching the world through the glass. The house had claimed him, not by taking him there, but by bringing the house to him. The wave he offered was the contract he signed, and now he was the one left in the dust. The explorer had become the exhibit,